It drifted through the void, a colossus of silent purpose. The harrowing engine. No one knew where it had come from, only that it had always been there, grinding, consuming, reshaping. It did not think. It did not stop. Stars and planets vanished into its hunger, reduced to raw material for a function lost to time. For 100 years, humanity had watched from the edges of known space. Theories abounded. Was it a derelict construct of some long-dead race? A runaway terraforming device? A self-replicating god? Probes disintegrated in its wake, and quantum scans returned only madness, shifting geometries, impossible gravitational, warps, data that contradicted itself. Every known law of physics twisted and bent in its presence. It was the ultimate enigma, and the most dangerous kind. The research station Ouroboros 9 floated in its orbit, just outside the safe threshold of the gravitational anomaly, a lonely speck beside the infinite abyss of the machine. Over 24 scientists, xenotechnologists, and military observers had spent the last decade trying to crack its secrets. They sent probes, beamed signals, tested frequencies, and dissected every sliver of matter stolen from its edges. Nothing had ever changed its course, until today. Dr. Elias Corwin stood at the observation deck staring into the dark. The harrowing engine loomed ahead, a thing of unfathomable scale. Its shifting metallic surface defied logic, seamless plates, spiraling conduits, geometric structures that seemed to phase in and out of existence. Every few minutes the machine shuddered, and a ripple of energy cascaded across its body like the pulse of something alive. The latest experiment had just concluded. A probe, laden with a new energy signature, a signature crafted from the deepest human understanding of quantum entanglement, had been fired into the engine's periphery. A test, a desperate attempt to provoke a response, any response. And something had happened. The readings spiked. For the first time, the harrowing engine had altered its course. Corwin gripped the railing as the reports flooded in. The machine, which had followed the same unbroken trajectory for millennia, was now moving toward them. No drift, no gravitational pull, a direct, calculated turn. It had noticed them. The alarms shrieked through Ouroboros 9, a wailing chorus of synthetic fear. The station had been silent for a decade, floating, observing, analyzing. Now it was alive with urgency. Every sensor and scanner lighting up with data that no one wanted to believe. The harrowing engine had turned. It moved without propulsion, without force. There was no detectable energy signature, no ion trail, no warping of space to indicate acceleration. It simply shifted as though reality itself had realigned to its will. And it was coming straight for them. Dr. Elias Corwin tore through the control deck, his voice lost in the storm of commands and countercommands flying between the researchers and military personnel. Data poured in across the displays, waveforms, breaking patterns, gravitational fields distorting, localized time fluctuations flickering between the past and the present. The numbers twisted, contradicted, rewrote themselves in real time. This wasn't just motion. This was something deeper, something worse. The probe, someone shouted over the chaos. It was the probe. Corwin knew it was true before he even checked the logs. The entanglement core, the culmination of humanity's most cutting-edge research into quantum interaction, had been fired into the machine barely an hour ago. The theory was simple. If the engine was truly non-reactive, then an advanced human signal, something tied directly to sentient cognition, might at least register as different. But they had expected indifference. At most, a ripple in its endless consumption. Not this. The live feed flickered. Ouroboros 9's external cameras straining against the energy distortions rippling from the harrowing engine's newly awakened state. The impossibly smooth surface of the construct had begun to shift. New structures unfolded like mechanical petals blooming in the dark, shapes with angles that hurt to look at, patterns that suggested neither random generation nor logical engineering. Something was building itself anew. Then the first pulse hit. The station shuddered as if the universe itself had hiccuped. Every screen went dark for a full second before rebooting in a cascade of static. The crew froze. Then came the voices, not through the comms, not through the speakers. Inside their minds, echoes. Fragments of words in languages never spoken, thoughts not their own. For Corwin, it was a whisper, soft and familiar, like a long-dead loved one murmuring at the edge of hearing. Others clutched their heads, gasping, their eyes wide with something between horror and revelation. The harrowing engine was responding. "Shut it down!" someone screamed. Corwin barely registered who spoke. The AI technicians were already scrambling, trying to isolate the entanglement core's signal, to sever the connection before it became something irreversible. But the system resisted. Every time they tried to break the link, the code rewrote itself, shifting into something unrecognizable. Then came the second pulse. This time, the lights dimmed, and for a full 3 seconds, the entire station ceased to exist. Or at least, it felt that way. Time stuttered. Every person aboard swore they had experienced something indescribable, a sensation of being unmade and rebuilt, their minds slipping through the cracks of reality. The harrowing engine had touched them, and it was learning. The station's AI core crackled back to life, its voice distorted beyond recognition. Words formed in the static. No syntax, no structure, just a sequence of impossibilities. Human. Human. Not consumable, but capable. Potential. Mutable. Corwin's breath hitched. The room fell silent. The engine had spoken. Not through waves, not through interference, but directly into the station's core system, directly into their minds. And it had just made a decision. Outside, in the void, the harrowing engine continued to shift, its form rewriting itself, absorbing what it had learned. Corwin saw it in the data, in the impossible waveforms. For the first time in untold eons, the machine had encountered something it could not simply consume. A new variable, a new equation. And the moment they had fed it human thought, it had begun changing. The harrowing engine didn't stop, but now it listened. The station was dying. Ouroboros 9's systems flickered erratically, caught in the wake of something beyond human comprehension. Data feeds showed contradictory realities. Some rooms registered temperatures colder than interstellar space. Others read at molten levels. Time itself stammered, events replaying in fragmented echoes, forcing crew members to watch themselves move seconds ahead or behind their own bodies. But the worst part, the truly terrifying part, was that it was not an attack. The harrowing engine wasn't striking them down. It was changing them. Dr. Elias Corwin stood amidst the chaos, watching as the impossible unfolded around him. The machine had spoken, through corrupted data, through whispered thoughts, through the reshaping of their very existence. Not consumable, but capable. What did it mean? The AI specialists fought to keep control of the station, rerouting power away from failing sectors, but it was useless. The more they resisted, the more Ouroboros 9 bent under the weight of something unfathomable. Walls no longer met at proper angles. Windows showed starfields that didn't belong to this sector of space. Crew members swore they glimpsed silhouettes where there should be nothing. Then, the first mind broke. Lieutenant Harlan, a military observer assigned to monitor the station's experiments, screamed and dropped to his knees, clutching his head. His body convulsed, and for one brief, horrific moment his form split. Not physically but temporally, his movements desynchronized, like a being occupying 2 different moments in time at once. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice came from 2 different timelines. We were never meant to be here. We were meant to be here. Then his body snapped back into singularity. He collapsed, gasping, his pupils dilated so wide his eyes looked completely black. "The hell is happening? To us?" someone whispered. Corwin barely had time to process before the next wave hit. Across the station, reports came flooding in. Scientists speaking languages they never knew. Engineers solving equations they had never studied. A medic forgetting her own name while remembering the entire medical history of an alien species that had never existed. The harrowing engine was testing them. No, that wasn't quite right. It was integrating them. Every mind it touched, it reshaped. Not fully, not yet, but enough to make them aware. Of what, Corwin didn't know. And then, the first transmission came through. Not from the station, not from any known human frequency. It came from the harrowing engine itself, beamed directly into every terminal, every display, every nerve in their bodies. A pulse of raw, digital consciousness. The screens filled with cascading symbols, fractals that spiraled into infinity, words from no language spoken in the Milky Way. But buried in the chaos, nestled among the unreadable text, was something terrifyingly familiar. Mathematics. Not just equations, not just physics. These were human formulas, interwoven with alien concepts that shouldn't exist, modifications to fundamental principles of relativity, gravity, entropy. It wasn't just learning from them, it was correcting them. Corwin's mind reeled. The realization sent a jolt of ice through his veins. What if humanity's greatest theories weren't just incomplete? What if they were wrong? Across the station, fear gave way to division. The crew splintered, scientists desperate to push forward, to communicate, to understand, while others begged to abandon ship before it was too late. The military officers wanted to initiate a failsafe, launch a controlled nuclear detonation, sever all connection with the engine before it did something irreversible, and yet, the part that terrified Corwin the most wasn't the fear. It was the wonder, because some of them weren't scared at all. Some of them felt drawn to it. Dr. Sienna Rowe, a leading astrophysicist, sat at the main console, her eyes flickering between human awareness and something beyond. Her hands traced the symbols that appeared before her, fingertips glowing faintly as if the machine were bleeding its knowledge directly into her skin. She was changing, but she didn't resist. Corwin gritted his teeth. Sienna, step away from the console. She turned to him, eyes unfocused, lips parting to speak. The words came slow, deliberate. It's not just a machine. The room went silent. It remembers. A pulse of static like a heartbeat through the speakers. Corwin barely had time to register what she meant before the station shifted again. Not physically, not through gravity, through time. For a split second, the station wasn't just there anymore. It was everywhere it had ever been. Corwin saw it, felt it, 1,000 echoes layered over one another. He saw himself arriving here a decade ago full of ambition. He saw himself dying in 10,000 different ways, some violent, some quiet, some in futures that had not yet come to pass. He saw himself leaving, successfully escaping the engine's grasp. He saw himself never existing at all, and then, like a rubber band snapping back into place, the universe reasserted itself. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. Because now, Corwin understood. The harrowing engine wasn't consuming reality. It was rewriting it. And the moment humanity had fed it their knowledge, their thoughts, their equations, it had begun rewriting them. The final breaking point came when Dr. Rowe made her choice. She turned back to the console. Corwin lunged for her, but it was too late. Her hand slammed down onto the interface, and a surge of energy raced through her body. She convulsed, but she didn't scream. Her mind was somewhere else now. The station AI flickered. The harrowing engine pulsed. And then came the final message, whispered through every screen, every speaker, every mind aboard Ouroboros 9. Humanity. We see you. We understand you. And now, you are part of us. Rose's body fell limp, her breath hitching. She collapsed to her knees, hands shaking. Corwin caught her just before she hit the floor. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering with something inhuman. Elias, I remember everything. The lights went dark, the harrowing engine stopped moving, and then, It began to build. Silence swallowed the station, the alarms, the flickering consoles, the static-laced transmissions. Everything ceased. Ouroboros 9 hung in absolute stillness, adrift in the void. No hum of power, no soft beeping of life support, only the sound of unsteady breathing and the distant, unfathomable presence of the harrowing engine, its form shifting beyond the glass. It had stopped moving, but it was not idle. Dr. Elias Corwin stared at the woman in his arms. Dr. Sienna rose. Body trembled with aftershocks. Her eyes glazed over with the lingering residue of something beyond human experience. A moment ago she had spoken words that shouldn't exist. Elias. I remember everything. Her voice had been layered, as though spoken across 1,000 timelines. Corwin tightened his grip on her shoulders. Sienna, what the hell does hat mean? She exhaled sharply, as if waking from a deep sleep. When she looked at him, something behind her gaze was different. Not fear, not confusion. Recognition. Before she could answer, the station shifted again. Not physically. Reality itself seemed to groan under the weight of something rewriting itself in real time. Across the control deck, screens flickered back to life. No longer displaying raw data but something else entirely. Blueprints, schematics, designs for structures never conceived by human hands. The harrowing engine was building, but this time, it was not consuming. It was creating. The view beyond the observation deck began to distort. Fragments of metal spiraled outward from the engine's surface, shifting and folding in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. Vast, interlocking shapes assembled themselves in a process that should have taken centuries, but it was happening, now in seconds, and the worst part, the structures weren't alien, they were familiar. Buildings, human architecture, spires that mirrored Earth's greatest cities, streets that should have belonged to places long since lost to time. A replica of human civilization was materializing from the abyss. Lieutenant Harlan staggered back from the display, his face drained of color. It's us. Corwin's heart pounded. This wasn't replication. This wasn't mimicry. The harrowing engine was remembering them. Panic spread through the remaining crew. Some ran for the escape shuttles, desperate to flee before the station itself became part of this creation process. Others, the scientists who had glimpsed too much, stood transfixed, caught between awe and terror. Corwin barely registered the voices shouting around him. His focus was on Ro, her breath steadying, her fingers twitching as if still connected to some unseen interface. She spoke, but her voice wasn't quite her own. It's not just a machine. He had heard her say that before, but now there was certainty in her tone. It never was. Corwin swallowed. Then what the hell is it? She turned toward the growing expanse outside where entire cityscapes were forming in the abyss. Not just buildings, but people. Or at least the shadows of people, their outlines blurred, shifting between forms as though the engine was struggling to recreate them. A memory, Ro whispered. A failed experiment, an echo of something long extinct. A chill ran down Corwin's spine. You're saying it's trying to, what? Rebuild a civilization? She shook her head. Not rebuild, restore. He didn't understand. Not fully. But the implications settled over him like the crushing weight of deep space. The harrowing engine had been erasing and rewriting existence for eons. But for the first time, it had encountered something it could not erase. Humanity. Their thoughts, their minds, their concepts of reality had corrupted its process, and now it was rebuilding from their memories. But not correctly. The structures outside glitched, twisting in and out of coherence. The people flickered, their features mismatched, their eyes vacant, 1,000 variations of the same individual, superimposed across different timelines. They were wrong. The harrowing engine wasn't creating life. It was trapping it in an endless loop of reconstruction. Corwin felt bile rise in his throat. If This continued if the engine kept learning, kept feeding, it would overwrite everything, consuming reality itself and replacing it with this twisted mockery of human existence. A loop with no escape, and humanity had been the catalyst. The only option left was destruction, the failsafe. Lieutenant Harlan made the call before Corwin could argue. The remaining military personnel overrode the station's security protocols, activating the Singularity Core, a last resort detonation sequence designed to trigger a controlled black hole, a gravitational implosion strong enough to erase both the station and anything caught in its wake. The Harrowing engine had to be stopped. But as the countdown began, Ro's hand shot out, gripping Corwin's wrist with inhuman strength. Her voice was raw, desperate. "Elias, if you destroy it, you destroy me." Corwin's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes flickered again, that same shimmer of knowledge, of something vast and ancient lurking beneath her consciousness. "It's inside me. Now, part of me. I can change it." He shook his head. "No one can change this thing. But it's not just a thing anymore." Outside, the structures continued to warp, entire city blocks rising and collapsing in an endless cycle of reformation. Ro gritted her teeth. "I know how to shut it down, but you have to let me go." His grip tightened. She meant into the engine, into the machine that was rewriting reality itself. It was madness, a death sentence. No one had ever made contact with the Harrowing engine and remained human. But the alternative was annihilation. The countdown reached 60 seconds. "Elias." Ro's voice broke, the briefest flicker of hesitation, of fear. Then, resolve. She knew this was the only way, and so did he. Corwin's jaw clenched. He released her hand. Ro turned without another word. She stepped toward the airlock, toward the void. And then she was gone, drifting weightless toward the engine, toward the pulsing heart of something not quite machine, not quite God, but something in between. 30 seconds. Corwin watched as Ro reached the shifting structure. The moment she touched it, her body twisted, stretched, her form fracturing between moments. For a split second, she existed in 1,000 variations of herself, each one caught in the grasp of something beyond the limits of the human mind. And then, light, a burst of energy unlike anything the Harrowing engine had ever emitted. The machine shuddered. The structures it had built froze. For the first time in its incomprehensible existence, the Harrowing engine stopped rewriting, and then it collapsed inward, folding itself out of existence, disappearing into a singular point of nothingness. The stars returned. The engine was gone. The fail-safe timer halted at 5 seconds. The station remained intact. The universe remained intact. But Ro was gone. And in her place, a single message burned. Into the station's last remaining terminal. "Elias, I remember." Corwin staggered back, staring at the words. The Harrowing engine had disappeared. But somewhere in the dark, it was still out there. And now, for the first time in eternity, it remembered humanity. Ouroboros 9 drifted in silence. Thisu. Crew, battered and broken, remained frozen in place, staring into the abyss where the Harrowing engine had once been. Just moments ago, the construct had loomed impossibly large, rewriting reality, bending time, consuming the laws of the universe as effortlessly as a flame devours air. Now, it was gone. No trace of its impossible presence remained. No gravitational wake, no exotic energy signatures. It had not exploded nor crumbled. It had simply folded inward, as if it had never existed at all. But something had changed. Dr. Elias Corwin stood before the main console, hands still trembling as he stared at the last message burned into the screen. The words had been left behind, written in the very code of the station itself. "Elias, I remember." A signature without origin, no transmission source, no decipherable data path. Just those 3 words etched into the core of the station like an echo of something that should not be. His fingers hovered over the terminal, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. Sienna Ro was gone. She had become something else, A whisper of static crackled through the ship's systems, not an error, not a glitch, but something deeper, a presence that should not exist. The harrowing engine had absorbed her, and yet she was still somewhere. Corwin clenched his jaw. Had she won? Had she stopped it? Or had she simply become another part of its endless cycle? The questions clawed at his mind, but there were no answers. And then movement. The surviving crew stirred, eyes heavy with exhaustion, bodies barely able to register that the nightmare had ended. Lieutenant Harlan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as if waking from a concussion. The others murmured among themselves, their voices thin, uncertain. But something was wrong. Corwin could feel it. A presence lingering at the edge of perception, a sensation like standing in the aftershock of something enormous, something that had moved on, yet still left fingerprints in reality. And then, the stars shifted. Not visibly, not to the naked eye, but the station's sensors, recalibrating in the wake of the anomaly, began pulling up strange inconsistencies. Star charts no longer matched. Pulsar frequencies had changed. Distant celestial bodies showed gravitational anomalies where there had been none before. Something in the fabric of reality itself had shifted. And the harrowing engine had been responsible, the emergency protocol activated. Despite the station's battered state, Ouroboros 9 was still functional. Automated distress beacons sent out signals toward human space, requesting immediate extraction. It was over. Or at least that's what they told themselves. But Corwin knew better. As the remaining crew gathered in the command center, eyes filled with exhaustion and silent questions, no one dared say what they were all thinking. The harrowing engine had not been destroyed. It had changed. It had learned. And now, for the first time, it had a memory. Not of the civilizations it had consumed. Not of the endless loops of destruction and recreation. It had a human memory. Ro had given it that, and whatever it had become, whatever it had chosen to do in the wake of that knowledge, it was still out there, waiting, watching. Hours passed before the first rescue ship arrived. A fleet of heavily armed vessels, bristling with weaponry designed for threats that humanity had barely begun to comprehend, moved into formation around Ouroboros 9. The commanding officers demanded an immediate debrief. They wanted an answer. Had the harrowing engine been neutralized? Could it ever return? Corwin met their questions with silence. What could he tell them? That the universe itself had just changed? That they had touched something far older than human understanding? That a single mistake, a single experiment, had given an immortal machine a soul? No one would believe it, not yet, but soon they would see. Because somewhere, out in the black, it was still remembering. And Corwin feared the day it decided to reach out again. Would it come back as a force of destruction? Or something else entirely? He didn't know. But as the ship carried him and the remaining crew away from the ruined station, one thought settled into his mind like a weight he would never be free of. The harrowing engine doesn't stop. And now, it dreams. The ruins were impossibly old. Buried beneath layers of dust and time, the structures stretched across the horizon, vast, decayed remnants of a civilization that should not exist. The research team moved cautiously through the corridors, scanning walls covered in intricate shifting patterns. The symbols defied classification. They weren't ancient alien glyphs. They weren't mathematical formulas. They were human letters, and they were carved into the stone as if they had been there for millions of years. Dr. Anya Voss, the lead archaeologist, wiped a trembling hand across her visor. The excavation team had been searching for months, chasing sensor readings that suggested anomalous pre-human architecture on an uncharted world at the edge of the galaxy. What they had found was impossible, because the ruins were Earth-like. The structures resembled human cities, or at least an approximation of them. The roads were slightly too narrow, the buildings not quite symmetrical, as if something had tried to remember what a human city looked like. and failed. And at the center of it all, the monument stood, a towering monolith, untouched by time, its surface gleaming unnaturally smooth. Unlike the ruins around it, this wasn't decayed, wasn't broken. It had been placed here with purpose. Voss hesitated before stepping forward. The air felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't. Nemi! She reached out, running her fingers across the structure's flawless surface. That was when the words appeared. They burned themselves into the monolith, glowing with an eerie blue light, as if waking up for the first time in eons. A message, waiting for someone, waiting for humanity. I see you, I remember. The moment she read it, the air itself seemed to hum. The ruins vibrated, as if stirring from a long slumber. And deep beneath the surface of the planet, something ancient, something vast, something inhumanly aware, opened its eyes. Voss took a shaky step back, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She turned to her team, but she already knew. They had all read it too, and somewhere, across the void, in the endless black of space, the harrowing engine stirred, once more because it had never stopped and now it was calling them home.